on. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I'm going to stop talking. You don't have to hear my voice for most of the rest of the night.
Shall we begin? I think it's time, even as people are arriving. Let's begin. Yai lai lai, yai lai lai, yai lai lai. Yai lai lai, yai lai lai, yai lai lai. Yai lai lai, yai lai lai, yai lai lai. Yai lai lai, lai 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 lai. Yai lai lai lai, yai lai lai. Yai lai lai lai, yai lai lai. Yai lai 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 lai. Yai lai 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 lai. Yai lai lai, yai lai lai, yai lai lai. Yai lai lai, yai lai lai, yai lai lai. Yai lai lai, yai lai lai, lai lai lai. Yai lai lai, lai lai lai, lai lai lai.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, Thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
Shabbat Shalom. I am Rabbi Mark Cohn of Temple Emmanuel in Winston-Salem. I think seeing all the screens up will give us an answer finally when people ask us, I didn't know there were Jews in North Carolina. You have a nice proof of that tonight. Our gathering tonight is made up of nearly a dozen North Carolina Reform congregations and many guests, most notably Rabbi Jonah Pesner, director of the URJ's Religious Action Center, and our featured speaker, Eric Ward, the Western State Center's executive director and senior fellow with the Southern Poverty Law Center and Race Forward. Welcome to you all. Many thanks to all those who have brought their love and their talent and their resources to make tonight possible, particularly the staff and clergy at Temple Beth El and Charlotte for all of your organizing, and Temple Beth Or and Raleigh who hosted the Kabbalat Shabbat. Thank you. We could spend all night talking about the beautiful song that we've just heard, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Indeed, the song's story, the meaning, the past touch our souls, and the connections and the combined narratives of Blacks and Jews make this song the most fitting of starts to our service and our combined efforts. Many thanks to Bethany Wary for your beautiful presentation of what is often called the Black National Anthem. You are a dear friend of Temple Beth El and Charlotte, and you have graced our statewide Shabbat service of Reformed Jewish congregations tonight. Thank you. I keep a picture on one of my office walls next to my books on Torah. The picture is a very famous one of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. marching from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. I trust many of you know that picture. In the line of civil rights leaders is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. It was from that walk that Heschel uttered what became one of his most famous quotes. In describing what it was like to walk with King, Heschel said, I felt as if my feet were praying. Friends from across our Tar Heel state, we are united in our praying and in our desire to walk in the footsteps of the greats who came before us, the likes of King and Heschel. This weekend is for us as Americans a chance to join our country in remembering and honoring the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. Every day for us as Jews, we are to live into and further the partnership embodied between the likes of King and Heschel during the Civil Rights era, Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington in the years of Jim Crow, and partnerships like the Religious Action Center and the Poor People's Campaign. My colleagues and I, with our congregations and local allies, are all deeply engaged in the work of repair, understanding, compassion, love, and justice, and we are humbled by the enormity of the tasks at hand when it comes to civil rights, social justice, and combating racism in this moment on the eve of a presidential inauguration. For tonight, we welcome Shabbat and offer our evening prayers. 6 days we are to work, and as the sun has now set and we're embraced by Shabbat and each other, we rest and we breathe, we lift our songs and we lift our souls in gratitude and in praise. May our gathering bring insight and inspiration, pause and reflection, hope and comfort. So when the new week begins, we can enter earnestly and with thoughtful intention. Shabbat Shalom.
We share these words from Dr. Martin Luther King from his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech in Oslo, 1964. He writes, "I refuse to accept despair as the final response to the ambiguities of history. I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the internal oughtness that forever confronts him. I refuse to accept the idea that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in the river of life, unable to influence the unfolding events which surround him. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality."
One of the things about Zoom is that it doesn't allow for more than one person to speak at a time. And yet we are gathered tonight in prayer and with inspiration. And so from the coast to the mountains, from north to south, from within North Carolina and beyond our borders, I ask that you raise your voice together with me as we read this prayer, this pledge together. When justice burns within us like a flaming fire, when love evokes willing sacrifice from us, when, to the last full measure of selfless devotion, we demonstrate our belief in the ultimate triumph of truth and righteousness, then your goodness enters our lives. Then you live within our hearts, and we, through righteousness, behold your presence.
Open up our eyes, teach us how to live, fill our hearts with joy and all the love you have to give. Gather us in peace as you lead us to your name, and we will know that you are one. And we will know that you are one. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. 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 Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad.
ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודך. והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך וקשרתם מאוד על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם.
Before we sing Mi Chamocha, they went forth from Egypt in a single night, but next time the miracle will be different. Once two sages were walking very early in the valley, and they saw the light of the morning star. Said one to the other, "This is how the redemption will be. The dawn breaks with a single ray of light, and bit by bit the sky is illumined, until morning comes and the darkness is gone. So the redemption will occur little by little, growing steadily and gradually until the world is full of light." Do not wait for a miracle or the sudden transformation of the world. Bring the day closer step by step with every act of courage, of kindness, of healing and repair. Do not be discouraged by the darkness. Lift up every spark you can and watch the horizon for the coming of the dawn. Look closely. It has already begun.
Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh, nora tehilot osef ele Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed. When Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go. Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed. Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed. So Moses went to Egypt's land, let my people go, to make old Pharaoh understand, let my people go. No more shall they in bondage toil, let my people go. Give them all of Egypt's spoil, let my people go. Mi chamocha Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed. Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed. Thus spoke the Lord, bold Moses said, let my people go. If not, I'll smite your firstborn dead. Let my people go. They journeyed on at his command. Let my people go. And came unto the promised land. Let my people go. Mi chamocha Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed. Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed. We need always to weep and mourn. Let my people go. And where the slavery chains forlorn, let my people go. Oh, let us all from bondage flee. Let my people go. And let us all breathe air that's free. Let my people go. Mi chamocha Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed. Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed.
I dream a world where man, no other man will scorn, where love will bless the earth and peace its paths adorn. I dream a world where all will know sweet freedom's way, where greed no longer saps the soul, nor avarice blights our day. A world I dream where black or white, whatever race you be, will share the bounties of the earth, and every man is free. Where righteousness will hang its head, and joy like a pearl attends the needs of all mankind. Of such I dream my world.
Hashkiveinu Adonai, Eloheinu l'shalom, V'hamidenu shomreinu l'chaim. Spread the shelter of your peace over us. Guide us in wisdom, compassion, and trust. Hashkiveinu Adonai, Eloheinu l'shalom, V'hamidenu shomreinu l'chaim. Save us for the sake of your name, that shield us from hatred, sorrow, and pain. Hashkiveinu Adonai, Eloheinu l'shalom, V'hamidenu shomreinu l'chaim.
In the Hashkiveinu prayer that we just sang, we revealed our need for protection in dark times. We too can move from darkness to light, as we did at the first creation. We too can move from chaos to creation, as we did in the first creation. When we do, we remind ourselves of the culmination of that week, the Sabbath, a day of rest and a day of peace. If we can fully realize the dual and complementary truths of unity and individuality, we can achieve a Shabbat like the very first. As Dr. King said in 1965, we must all learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools. Let us choose life together. Let us choose creation. Let us pray from the depths of our hearts to find the unity that we know we possess. So we will first join our voices together with Vishamru celebrating the Sabbath. And then slowly together, we will ask to open our lips in prayer as we enter the Amidah. Then we will continue in our hearts as individuals in silent prayer, reciting traditional words, reading words from Dr. King, or using no words at all, letting our hearts speak all on their own. So let us continue now together with singing Vishamru.
Vishameru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat lidorotam berit olam. Beini uvein b'nei Yisrael, oti le'olam, ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Yai lai lai lai, yai lai 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 lai, yai lai lai lai, yai lai lai lai, yai lai lai lai, yai lai 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 lai, yai lai lai lai, yai lai 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 lai. Uvayom hashivi shavat vayinafash. Uvayom hashivi shavat vayinafash. Yai lai 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 lai, 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 yai lai 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 lai. Adonai sifatai tiftach ufi agit tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise.
dai, ya la 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 dai. Olam chesed yivanei, ya la dai, ya dai, ya la 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 dai. Olam chesed yivanei, ya la dai, ya dai, ya la 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 dai. Olam chesed yivanei, ya la dai, ya dai, ya la 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 dai. I will build this world from love. Ya la dai, ya dai, ya la 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 dai. And you must build this world from love. Ya la dai, ya dai, ya la 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 dai. And if you build this world from love, ya la dai, ya dai, ya la 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 dai, then God will build this world from love. Ya la dai, ya dai, ya la 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 dai.
Thank you, Patty. In 1967, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic." He added, "Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love." And this is what we must see as we move on. Poignant words then, prophetic words today. One of my friends, colleagues, and teachers who has taught me most about power and love and how to join hands across lines of race and class and faith to use that power wisely and powerfully is Rabbi Jonah Dov Pesner. Rabbi Pesner serves as the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, and he also serves as the senior vice president of the Union for Reform Judaism. He is an inspirational national Jewish leader, an advocate, and organizer for change. And he and the Union for Reform Judaism are our partners with our communities. And Rabbi Pesner is the person who first introduced me to Eric Ward, our speaker this evening. It is my pleasure to invite my friend, our rabbi, Rabbi Jonah Pesner, to introduce Eric Ward this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Asher Knight. I love you, and I love seeing you on Zoom. I love seeing all of my rabbi and cantor and clergy colleagues from North Carolina and all of my beloved North Carolina family. You are not new to me. I have been to North Carolina both to speak in some of your synagogues and to teach in your congregations, but I've also been down to give the first sermon ever by a rabbi at the installation of the president of the NAACP chapter of the State Conference of North Carolina when Reverend William Barber was president of the NAACP. And I've been down to North Carolina at your invitation and at his to join together folks from the NAACP and folks from the Reformed Jewish congregations of North Carolina to, in a nonpartisan 501c3 appropriate way, reach across lines of class and race and neighborhood to make sure that kol kolot, as we say in Hebrew, every voice is heard when every vote is counted, no matter which party or which ideology people resonate with. And so it's a pleasure, Rabbi Asher Knight, and I have to invoke the name of Rabbi Fred Gutman, who is such a passionate, of all of the rabbis and clergy on this call, advocate for being a Reformed Jewish movement and convening and getting together. The Union for Reform Judaism, which is the largest and most diverse denomination in Jewish life, is so proud of our North Carolina congregations, and I'm honored to be your vice president. And the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, which I lead, could not have a more loyal and activated base than the folks in North Carolina who fight for voter engagement and fight against voter suppression, who have reached across lines of difference to make North Carolina a better state and make the cities and communities you live in better. Some of you may know that the historic Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were written in your conference room, the conference room of the Religious Action Center Reform Judaism in Washington, D.C. But that would be, as Rabbi Knight quoted King, simply sentiment and anemia. If we just remember the pictures of King and Heschel marching together, no, we will not be sentimental or nostalgic or anemic about it. We'll think about the moment that we are in, a moment of COVID in which so many of you in our Reform congregations have innovated and found new ways to come together, to be in Facebook and on Zoom, to have Shabbat and have holidays, but to show up for each other's hospitals and funerals and life cycle events, to be a community despite COVID. And when we were nervous that during this pandemic, which is disproportionately affecting Black and brown and Native people and poor people, that you would just turn inward, North Carolina Reformed Jewish family, but you didn't. You also reached your hands and asked, how could we make our cities and our communities and our towns better for the most vulnerable, for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger? And amidst the racial reckoning that we are going through in the spirit of Freddie Gray and Tamir Rice and Michael Brown and Sandra Blount and now Breonna Taylor, and of course, George Floyd, you have asked, how can we become anti-racist congregations? How can we be the civil rights era of this moment? And in the face of an election in which democratic norms were threatened, in North Carolina, where a federal court ruled that the voter suppression law that had been passed was racist with surgical precision, you asked, how can we, the Reformed Jews of North Carolina, organize and build power to bring about love? And you did. 15,000 Reformed Jewish leaders reached 560,000 voters in this last election in a nonpartisan 501c3 appropriate way, just to make sure that no matter how vulnerable, no matter how marginalized, every vote would count. And then, my North Carolina family, what we saw last week, a violent, riotous mob assaulting our nation's capital, occupying the US Capitol for more than 4 hours. This white supremacist terrorist attack, and they wore t-shirts like Camp Auschwitz, and 6 million wasn't enough. White supremacy, racism, and anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish bigotry cannot be unspooled from one another. And no one knows that better than our beloved friend, our teacher, our mentor, the prophet among us, Eric Ward. Eric Ward may not be a Jew technically, but Eric Ward is like Jethro, who counseled Moses and his Jewish family. Eric stands outside the Jewish community, speaking truth, but he holds inside the Jewish community an enormous hug because we love him and adore him. There is no better teacher and organizer who can help us understand and explain the violent white supremacist threat, which is inherently anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic, and also give us the tools and the tactics and the strategies to do the work that King would call us to do today. Black and brown, Latino, Asian, white, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, no faith and all faith, to come together to actually empower this country, the country that it aspires to be, the more perfect union. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce you to my friend, my brother, and my soulmate, the prophet among us, Eric Ward.
Rabbi Presner, it's such a pleasure to hear your voice, and I look forward to when we are together again. It has been a long year indeed. Many of us have carried an incredible burden over the last year, but it's also been a long 4 years. I think about all that we have carried in this moment. COVID-19, a global pandemic, It has now taken in the last 10 months, 1 out of every 750 Black and Indigenous lives in the United States. I'll say that number again because it's hard to hold and imagine. 1 out of every 750 Black people and 1 out of every 750 Indigenous people here in the United States has now died from COVID-19 in the last 11 months. But it's not just the pandemic. It's the economic instability that we face as a nation due to that pandemic and due to income inequality in our society. The disparity of wealth. Currently in the United States, at least 31 million Americans are out of work. The number is likely much higher. Those who have long given up on the opportunity of employment in this country. But it's not just a pandemic and economic instability. It's the rise of political violence. We witnessed that rise last Wednesday on January 6th in Washington, D.C., where the alt-right, driven by a white nationalist ideology, attempted a coup in our nation's capital. We've carried so much, and I know that we are exhausted, but I'm not here to speak about the darkness. I'm here to talk about the darkness because, as Martin Luther King Jr. once told us, it is in the darkness that we begin to understand the importance of the light, that it's in the darkness that we begin to find our way forward. And so this evening, I want to speak to that darkness, but not to pull us in and to trap us, not to weigh us down. We speak about the darkness today so that we can find our way forward, our way from the mountaintop into the promised land. This story of white nationalism doesn't begin last week, nor does it begin 4 years ago. It has been a long road for the white nationalist movement from the margins to the mainstream. It begins within the victories of the 1965 civil rights movement. And I'll explain. You all may remember this thing called the civil rights movement, particularly you in North Carolina. We were told in school of a woman by the name of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a Black woman who on one day was tired. And on that one day that she was tired, I was taught in school, she decided not to give up her seat. And because she decided not to give up her seat, she was arrested. And lo and behold, almost like manna from heaven, the entire Black community in Montgomery, Alabama, suddenly knew to stay off the city buses. Not only did they know through osmosis to stay off the city buses, but they suddenly knew to give each other a ride back and forth to work, not just for a day, not just for a month, but for nearly an entire year. Indeed, it was one of the greatest miracles to ever take place in the United States. Then after that year, we are told, the Montgomery Bus Association simply decided that segregation was wrong and ended it, and that everyone lived happily ever after. Now we know that's not the story of Rosa Parks. Neither is it the story of civil rights in this country. Rosa Parks was a long respected leader in her community. She was a civil rights organizer, the secretary of the NAACP in her community. We also know now that she and others had gathered in a place outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, called the Highlander Center for Research and Education. And she and other civil rights organizers had gathered together to try to understand how they challenged the spiritual sin of segregation in American society. We know now that Rosa Parks was not the first to be arrested. Many were arrested before her. Many attempted to be arrested before her. But she was the person that ignited the community. No one quite understands, but they know that if they did not have those relationships in place, if they had not practiced, if they had not stretched and leaned, that they would not have been able to galvanize not only the civil rights movement in Montgomery, Alabama, but across the country. This civil rights movement was victorious in destroying white supremacy as the rule of law. When we talk about white supremacy, what we mean is a system of discrimination that was both historic and present day. That it was a system built off the idea of white superiority, that white people were superior than other people merely based on the color of their skin. Why was this belief in white superiority so important? Why did our society need to socialize people into believing that they were inferior or superior off the basis of their skin? Well, it's because of the way that society chose to organize. You see, white superiority was critical to allowing three things to happen in this land. The first was the stolen resources and lives of Native people. The second was a system of chattel slavery. And the third, not often addressed, was misogyny, the control of sexuality, and primarily the control of women and sexual minorities in the United States. It is these three pillars that make the United States part of the abundant economy that it is today. It came at the sacrifice of generations of lives who were faced into a form of slavery that was so brutal that it was called the peculiar institution, a system that intentionally sought over generations to deny Black people their humanity, a system that allowed until the 1970s in this country the physical beating of women simply because they had entered into marriage. It was a system that allowed the systemic killing of Native people in one of the largest genocides to ever take place in this continent. White supremacy marched across this land before there was even a United States of America. It is this white supremacy that was challenged by the civil rights movement. Now, I want everyone to take a deep breath. I have to tell you something. None of us need feel guilty for that system. None of us are responsible for that system of white supremacy. None of us were here when it was established. Our only obligation is to challenge its present day ramifications and to take it on in our lives, to rid it from our society. But it is that system of white supremacy that was defeated by the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Now, I'm of a younger generation. I came up in the post-civil rights movement. I didn't understand the choiceless choices of my parents and of my grandparents. Indeed, in the height of the Black Lives Matters movement, there was a very popular t-shirt that was circulating, and many of my friends would wear it. And it said, "Not my mama's civil rights movement," pointing to the 1960s. As I learned about the civil rights movement, I began to tease my friends back. And I would tell them, "You're right. We aren't our mother's civil rights movement. Our mother's civil rights movement was badass." And what I mean by that is that our mother's civil rights movement had to function in a society when white supremacy was uncontested as the rule of law. It was the only lens upon which we were allowed to see and interpret our society. Whether we are talking about economics, whether we are talking about religion, whether we are talking about arts and culture or politics, white supremacy was the uncontested God. And along came these humble Black Southerners and their allies from around the country, many of them disproportionately Jewish. Now, I'm not here to draw rainbows and unicorns about the Black-Jewish relationship, but I do want to point out that Jews were present in that fight, and they were allies, but they also had their own skin in the game. For you see, many of the Jews who participated disproportionately in that civil rights movement were the descendants or the survivors of another form of racism in Europe, a form of anti-Jewish bigotry known as anti-Semitism. The idea that Jews were of another race, not merely of another religion. These brothers and sisters and others joined with Southern Blacks, and they won significant policy, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, but also the Immigration Reform Act that overturned white supremacist policy at the federal level. It was immigration and refugee laws that prevented Jews from fleeing Europe to safety to the United States. Indeed, Anne Frank's family was turned back from the United States, where many of them ended up perishing at the hands of Nazi Europe. It was a significant victory. But imagine for a second, imagine that you are an arch segregationist. You believe Black people are inferior in every way. How then do you come to terms with the fact that you just lost to Black people? And not only lost, but lost significantly. For you see, the civil rights movement of the 1960s brought uncontested white supremacy upon a field where it could be contested, where it would be challenged, not just by African Americans, but by religious minorities, by Muslims, by immigrants, by Latinos, by women, by the trans community. It is these Blacks in the South and their Jewish allies who carved the path for where we stand today. For these arch segregationists, they were never going to allow that they lost to Black people. They had been socialized too long. Their hearts had been hardened in such a way that they would never give Black people their agency, never recognize the legitimate grievances that they held. This is why I say, if white supremacy is about a system of discrimination, white nationalism was the answer to the defeat of that segregation by Black people and their allies. For them, the answer became that Jews were responsible, borrowing from the old writings, anti-Semitic fake writings of the protocols of the elders of Zion. These new white nationalists in the late 60s began to construct a new narrative. While we hear the term the alt-right, a broad coalition that is made up of authoritarians around the country, we should understand that at the core of that movement is white nationalism. If white supremacy is a system, white nationalism is a social movement. It is the antithetical social movement to the civil rights movement in this country. And anti-Semitism is at its core. It is not just one of the core. It is the core of its ideology. And anti-Semitism is so central to white nationalism that I believe that Black people and other marginalized groups will never win our freedom if we're not also active in the struggle to uproot anti-Jewish hate. Amongst 21st century white nationalists, Jews are cast in the same role they have always filled for anti-Semites, as the absolute other, demons stirring a pot of lesser evils and the driving force behind white dispossession. At the foundation of this modern day movement is the explicit claim that Jews are a separate race, not a religious other. and that this position as white is framed as the greatest trick the devil has ever played. For white nationalists, Jews, despite and indeed because many are perceived as white, are cast as an enemy race that must be exposed and eliminated. It is this fantasy of invisible Jewish power that explains for the white nationalist movement how Black Americans, a race of supposed inferiors, could orchestrate the end of Jim Crow, how feminists in the LGBTQ community could upend traditional gender roles, and how immigrant workers could mount a successful challenge to economic inequality in the United States. Folks often ask me, where is the anti-Semitism in the white nationalist movement? I tell folks that it's everywhere. When the Tree of Life shooter said Jews were committing a genocide against white people, he was using a language that was intimately familiar to his fellow white nationalists. Such rabid anti-Semitism is the framework in which the entire white nationalist movement functions. Now, I'm not saying that everyone within the white nationalist movement or in the alt-right coalition is a hardened anti-Semite. What I'm saying is that the narrative that they use to justify anti-democratic tendencies, authoritarianism, and the dehumanization of others is driven by an anti-Semitic narrative. Many of us are familiar with QAnon, a vast conspiracy that has been spreading around the country, infecting people, children, adults, and others. The QAnon conspiracy frames Donald Trump as a hero who is secretly warring against a political elite, a conspiratorial cabal that controls finance, culture, and politics, that uses democratic practice in order to exploit and take advantage of children sexually. It is that conspiracy that has led to violence and murder across the United States. For many of us, we hear this narrative and it doesn't make sense. But it doesn't make sense if you don't understand anti-Semitism. If you understand anti-Semitism, you understand that QAnon is just a modern day version of that Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion was created as a document in the early 1900s. This may sound parallel, but it was created by Russian secret police who were afraid about the spread of democracy in Europe. And they used it to sow dissension and to divide communities in order to maintain power amongst the kings and princes and queens and royalty of Europe. The protocols purported to tell a story, the story of Jewish elders who gathered in a cemetery at midnight to plot the takeover of the world and the destruction of European Christendom. Eventually, the protocols were brought back to Russia. And then those Russian immigrants who came to the United States brought the protocols with them. It's a powerful narrative. While false and dangerous, it continues to resonate. Even then it resonated. Eventually, a man by the name of Henry Ford, an automobile industrialist who brought forth the mass production of the automobile, came across the protocols. He was taken by the narrative. It fed his already latent anti-Semitism. Henry Ford was so moved by the protocols that he republished them in a series of essays in his newspaper that was distributed in Ford dealerships across the country. It is that narrative that began to seed the white nationalist movement before it was even born. For white nationalists, anti-Semitism explains the world. They not only explains the world for them, but it motivates them to violence. Whether we are talking about the attacks on Latinos in El Paso at a Walmart, or the attacks on Sikhs in Wisconsin, driven by hatred of Muslims, or the attacks on Black worshipers in a church in Charleston, South Carolina, or Jews worshiping in Pittsburgh. While yes, anti-Black racism was evident, anti-Latino bigotry, and Islamophobia, we have to understand that for each of those killers, not only were they othering those who have survived racism and white supremacy in America, but they also saw themselves at war, in an existential war against the Jewish community. It is why I often argue that anti-Semitism is not merely a threat to the Jewish community, but to non-Jews as well. It has taken many lives at this point. And I think about Martin Luther King, and I think about this moment and how dark it feels. As we head towards inauguration, we hear warnings of increased political violence. I can't tell you that those warnings aren't true. Indeed, we at Western State Center and at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and my colleagues at the Anti-Defamation League, and many other civil rights leaders are very concerned about the political violence. But we're also angry. We're angry because we understand that anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, sexism, and anti-Muslim bigotry don't come to our communities brought by white nationalists and others, that they simply organize the bigotry that already exists. We are angry because for far too long, we have left ourselves vulnerable. I think of a young alt-right activist in Portland, Oregon, who took part in a demonstration here about 4 years ago. I remember watching him being harangued by a citizen reporter with a video camera stuck in the face of this alt-right activist. And I remember him shouting at this activist saying, "Why are you here in Portland? No one wants you here. The mayor doesn't want you here. These protesters don't want you here. I don't want you here. Why are you here?" And what that young alt-right activist said should haunt us all. He replied to that person, "Yes, I've heard you don't want us here. But the truth is," he said, "Portland is a city with a shrinking Black population by both percentage and whole number." He went on to clip, "You can say you don't want us here, but the fact of the matter is you are doing something we could never do. You are disappearing the Black population of Portland." In short, he was calling us hypocrites. He was telling us that our inability and our unwillingness to address the systemic racism of this moment has left us vulnerable. We saw this all too well in Washington, D.C., where law enforcement officers, elected officials, and others chose their ideology over the rule of law, chose authoritarianism over the common good, and chose their implicit bias over their mission to protect and serve and to defend the Constitution. When we ask ourselves, how did the white nationalist movement move from the margins to the mainstream from 1968 to 2021? We have to be brave enough to first pick up the mirror and to take a deep look. We have often used our idea of neutrality, the idea that somehow there is an equal battle going on our side between racial justice activists and those who would like to engage in ethnic cleansing. We pretend that saying Black Lives Matters is controversial. We turn our backs on young Black and Jewish activists who are struggling to figure out this world and to move it forward to a place of hope, safety, and prosperity. In short, we have spent our time navel gazing, and our country has paid the price. I am enraged around the moment we are in right now. I think about that massacre down in Charleston, South Carolina, where white nationalist Dylann Roof gunned down 9 Black lives during a Bible study session he had been welcome to attend. I remember the words he later wrote. I would like to make crystal clear, I do not regret what I did, he said. I have not shed a tear for the innocent people I killed. I share a tear tonight, not just for those congregants, but for all those whose lives have been lost over these years. I shed a tear that we chose not to align and stand in solidarity until things were so bleak that we didn't know the way forward. When I find a place for the rage and grief, I have to look towards Martin Luther King. And I think of his speech, I've been to the mountaintop. It was the last speech that Martin Luther King Jr. gave. We all remember that speech on April 4th, 1968. Dr. King was murdered that day outside his Memphis motel room, also assassinated by a white nationalist. Martin Luther King left this earth that day, never receiving the majority of support from the American public. We should remember that today, Black Lives Matter receives more support from white America than Martin Luther King did while he walked the earth. This is an important day for us to remember, and it should never be forgotten. It was that day before, when Martin Luther King was still with us, that he was speaking to an overflowed room. Here's what he said. If the Almighty said to me, which age would I like to live in? Strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty and say, if you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. I can imagine him saying those words. And I remember the other things he said, asking us and reminding us that he had been to the mountaintop. I wrote recently during this period that I can feel that mountain and I can see us climbing it. We are struggling to reach the top. And I know in this moment as I speak to you, that climb feels long, it feels muddy, and the rocks are making us weary. And we all know weary, don't we? I don't have to tell you about weary. The aches and tears of the weary in a way that our country is struggling to comprehend. The weary that comes in the form of racist brutality, bodies broken by bullets, gas, slurs, and the ropes around the limbs of trees. The weary that comes from hunger, neglectful healthcare, and stolen dreams. We understand Martin Luther King's weary that comes from disrespect and invisibility. But I want to take you back to Memphis that night. And I want to take you back to that mountainside. And I want you to understand and imagine Dr. King is right here with us. We know he is weary as we are. And he tells us he is not sure he will be able to make that climb with us. But he tells us that it doesn't matter. He isn't worried about anything. You see, he knows he is going to be killed. And you can hear it in the shaking but determined quake of his voice. As sure as he knows that, he knows another truth as well. Looking at all of us climbing, struggling to hang on, he tells us, I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. the promised land can feel far from view when white nationalists drive insurrection in our nation's capitals, when they attack our houses of worship. But leading in times of easiness is well easy, isn't it? But these times aren't them. In truth, we all know what we are witnessing right now. We just don't want to say it out loud. We are witnessing the end of one age and the beginning of another. These are the times of great beauty, but also times of great horror. While the new world is unfolding, we still walk amidst an old world that has not yet realized that the binary is no longer needed. Martin Luther King said, quote, "Another reason I'm happy to live in this period is that we have been forced to a point where we are going to have to grapple with the problems that men have been trying to grapple with through history, but the demands didn't force them to do it." Quote, I want to tell each of you listening, it is a heavy lift to walk between two worlds. I feel the pressure on my shoulders and the nudge of pain in my middle back. I feel it in the tears that fall slowly from the corner of my eyes as I speak to you right now. I think you may feel it too. How does it affect our climb towards justice, opportunity, and true democracy in America? How do we lead in such a moment? How do we not only walk our talk, but help others to do so as well? We lead in this moment by understanding that we too can see the promised land. We are no longer climbing for ourselves. Here today, we climb for our ancestors and for the generations to come. They are worthy of our sacrifices at this moment. So I encourage you all today to climb not out of fear, but because we choose abundance over scarcity, inclusion over violence, and love over death. We climb knowing that we don't get to the promised land unless we bring everyone with us across the mountaintop. So here we all stand today at the mountaintop, barely able to see what's ahead of us because we have to keep looking back, waiting for too many people to join us, not just for a night of protest, but for the long work of the climb. Can you hear me tonight? I'm calling on you to climb just a little bit more. You see, it's your freedom too. It's the freedom that Black people have been climbing for hundreds of years. It's been paid for with 500 years of Indigenous and African blood. Can you hear us tonight? There is nothing to fear, and it's time for you to move. No more rehearsals. This is the actual event, and we are determined that we get over the mountaintop this time. How about you? Stand up, get moving. History will judge you. This is your opportunity to join the 21st century civil rights movement. Welcome, and we embrace you. It's time to move. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for your inspiring words and for encouraging us to climb one step at a time, holding hands with each other, looking towards the promise and potential of the future, and walking hand in hand towards that promise together. Thank you for the words that come from your heart and from a lifetime of experience. And we thank you for your friendship, not only for our communities here in North Carolina, but also for the Reformed Jewish movement and the work that you are doing to shape our leadership and to help us with resources that not only inspire, but helped us to understand this moment in time and what it's at stake. I also want to thank the communities that have made this possible. congregations that have come together from across North Carolina, thank you for your support and your resources to make this evening possible. For those that want to get involved and connect with your congregations and connect with the Religious Action Center, the website is www.rac.org. And from the websites, you can learn to advocate your members of Congress, to listen to the voices of Jews of color, and to do this work hand to hand across lines of difference. I learned recently from my colleague and friend, Rabbi Peter Berg, that the song We Shall Overcome was originally titled I Will Overcome. And I never knew that. But it was changed to We Shall Overcome as a way of bringing people together for the civil rights struggle. John Lewis of blessed memory used to say that when he was beaten on Bloody Sunday, We Shall Overcome sustained him throughout his struggle. In the Jewish faith, one of the We Shall Overcome songs and prayers is that of the Mishaberach. For those who have tears in their eyes, and for those who have walked through challenging times, for those who are broken in spirit or body or soul, we pray that we all will overcome someday. And so we invite you to type into the chat box the names of people that you are praying for this evening. And we join hands now across our video screens and pray, Ana el Narufanallah. Please, God, bring them wholeness and send strength to those who love and care for each one of us. May we each and everyone in our communities be healthy in spirit, in body, and in soul, and guide us all to a better time. Blessed are you, O God, who walks with and comforts those who are in need.
May the source of strength who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say Amen. Misheberach imotenu mekor habracha avotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shalema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Amen.
We cannot merely pray to you, O God, to end war, for we know that you have made the world in a way so that all of us must find our own path to peace within ourselves and with our neighbors.
We cannot merely pray to you, O God, to end starvation, for you have already given us the resources with which to feed the entire world, if only we would use them wisely.
We cannot merely pray to you, O God, to root out our prejudice, for you have already given us eyes with which to see the good in all people, if we would only use them rightly.
We cannot merely pray to you, O God, to end despair, for you have already given us the power to clear away slums and to give hope, if only we would use our power justly.
We cannot merely pray to you, O God, to end disease, for you have already given us great minds with which to search for cures and healing, if we could only use them constructively.
Therefore, we pray to you instead, O God, for strength, determination, and courage to do instead of just pray, to become instead of merely to wish.
עלינו לשבח לדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצא בראשית, שלא עשה סוכריה הרצות, ולא שמענו ככוחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגר עלינו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. ונאמר והויה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד.
My dear friends, this was a year in which we lost 5 civil rights icons. Certainly at the top of any list would have to be the name of Congressman John Lewis. In 1965, Lewis led the march whose goal was to march from Selma to Montgomery to protest for voting rights. He, as you probably know, was beaten to within an inch of his life as he was attempting to lead marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The day became known as Bloody Sunday. As a congressman, he was the lead co-sponsor during his career of 21 bills, which were passed, 21 bills which were passed. This in itself, my friends, is an extraordinary achievement. For the past 2 decades until his death this year, Congressman Lewis led dignitaries and elected officials on an annual pilgrimage from Selma to Selma, an annual pilgrimage to Selma to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the Sunday after Bloody Sunday. In 2014, I was nominated by Senator Kay Hagan of blessed memory to attend this pilgrimage. I was blessed to spend 2 days on a bus with the congressman. Together, we walked through the home of Medgar Evers in Jackson, Mississippi. And the next day, we marched together across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. As we were traveling from Mississippi to Alabama, I was able to interview Congressman Lewis concerning his memories of the famous relationship between Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. The interview is precious and may be found in YouTube, and I will shortly post in the chat how it can be found. You know, when I look back upon those 2 days, I was amazed at I am amazed at how accessible this civil rights Rebbe was to someone like me. And these 2 days became seared into my mind. Congressman Lewis's most famous quote is, "When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to stand up, speak out, and find a way to get in the way and get in trouble. Good trouble, necessary trouble." This quote was on a poster in the Capitol outside of Congressman Steny Hoyer's office. It was destroyed on January 6th, but it has now been replaced. Friends, we are living in a state which in the last decade was referred to as a state of ground zero for voter suppression. The historical protection of the right to vote had been removed by the Supreme Court's 2013 ruling in Shelby versus Holder. And states like ours rushed within days to pass measures that would historically reduce voting by the poor and communities of color. So tonight, how can we honor the memory of Congressman John Lewis? How can we get into good trouble? The answer is so clear to me. In the next Congress, a bill entitled the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act will be introduced. Among other things, this bill will restore the protection of the right to vote of Section 5 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, an act, by the way, which was partially written on the table at the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. I am sure that our movement will lobby extensively for the passage of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. And we here in North Carolina will need to do our part as Reform Jews to lobby our senators and representatives in Congress. On this holy Shabbat, we also remember the following civil rights giants whose God has called to their eternal rest during the past year. These beloved and precious leaders were Reverend Joseph Lowery, known as the Dean of the Civil Rights Movement, who along with Martin Luther King founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Corey Tyndall, or C.T. Vivian. Vivian was known as Martin Luther King's field general. He was a disciplined advocate for nonviolence and was on the front lines in the 1960s movement for racial justice. Bruce Boynton. Who was Bruce Boynton? He was an Alabama civil rights leader who is credited with inspiring the freedom rides. And lest we not forget, Katherine Johnson, the African-American mathematician whose calculations of orbital mechanics as a NASA employee were critical to the success of the first and subsequent US crewed space flights. She was featured in the movie Hidden Figures. Congressman John Lewis, Reverend Joseph Lowery, C.T. Vivian, Bruce Boynton, Katherine Johnson, and of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Great human beings and Americans who left us great legacies to inspire us to work for justice, and great legacies to get into some good trouble, necessary trouble. May their memories be a blessing now and always.
Zikronam Livracha. May their memories be for a blessing. So too, as we remember all of those who are of color, who have died disproportionately during these times of this pandemic, and all of those of color who have been taken by violence during these times. Zikronam Livracha. May their memories be for blessing as we join together in the words of the Kaddish. Yitkadash Shemei Rabbah, Be'alma Divrach Hirutei Ve'almich Malchutei, B'chayachon U'vyomechon U'chayei D'kol Israel, Ba'agala U'bizman Kariv V'imru Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabbah Mevorach Leolam Omei Almaya, Yitparak V'yishtabak V'yitpa'ar V'yitramam V'yitnaseh, V'yitadar V'yitaleh V'yitalal Shemei D'Kudusha V'yichu. Le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, da'amiran be'alma v'imru Amen. Yehi Shlama Rabba min Shemayim v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. Osei shalom b'imrumav, u'ya'asei shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru Amen. May the one who creates harmony on high bring peace to us and all Israel and all the world, and let us say, Amen.
Ose shalom bimromav, huyase shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, ve'imiru Amen.
As we close tonight's service, we thank God for this past year. Well, some of it, because during this past year, we have all experienced burning bush moments. As Moses heard in the Exodus story, we've heard this divine voice. It may have been the voice of Jonah Pestner or the voice of Eric Ward, but it calls us to pursue justice. And as Moses felt, we feel reluctant because we struggle to find clear paths, to find specific directions, to fight for justice. So remind us, God, about those interfaith and multiracial coalitions of the 1960s, which we have heard about tonight, so that we can form coalitions that speak to our needs today. Push us to retell the story as we have heard from Rabbi Pesner and Rabbi Gutman tonight about the Leadership Conference of Civil Rights, which met at the RAC's conference room to draft the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so that we can be the ones to draft the legislation and do the actions needed today. And show us, God, as Eric Ward pointed out, that we have more power today, more connections today, more support today than the civil rights movement had in the 1960s. And through that, inspire us to continue the battle to fulfill the dream of Dr. King. And as we are all committed to that battle, we might all say, Amen.
Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed your grace on thee, for brotherhood and sisterhood, from sea to shining sea.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome today. We shall all be free. We shall all be free. We shall all be free today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome today. We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we are not afraid today. Oh, beautiful for heroes proved in liberating strife, who more than self their country love, and mercy more than life. America, America, may God thy gold refine, till all success be nobleness, and every gain divine.
America, America, God shed your grace on thee, for and sisterhood from sea to shining sea. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.